It's the latest offensive in the grinding war against Daesh in Syria. The Syrian Democratic Forces, or SDF, leading the onslaught on the terror group's de facto capital in Raqqa. The SDF is primarily made up of the YPG, allied to the terrorist PKK organization. The PKK has claimed thousands of Turkish lives over the past decades. Turkey has been clear in its objection to the YPG's involvement in the fight.
If
Turkey sees a YPG movement in northern Syria that is a threat to it and realizes this is a national threat, it will retaliate in kind. As a matter of fact, you see that fire from Afrin is answered in kind. This isn't a fantasy for us. This is not becoming a part of the war in the Middle East. On the contrary, it is an indispensable approach to protect Turkey's border security.
But the US has insisted that its strategy is working.
You've been reading some of the headlines. We're making some progress down in Syria. We're hopeful that we can replicate that with Turkey on some areas in the northern part of Syria. So we're going to be working hard on those issues.
The SDF has besieged Raqqa and is slowly forcing its way into the city. It's part of a campaign that's brought it territory stretching from Kobani in the west to Al-Malikiya in the east. It also controls the northwestern Afrin district. That stretches from Bulbul to Tal Rifat, which serves as a vital supply base. The SDF wants to link Tal Rifat to the territory beginning from Kobani. They say it's essential to set up the supply line for an eventual push into Daesh's heartland to the southeast. It's happening as another front appears to be opening in neighboring Idlib to the Hay'et Tahrir al-Sham group, with Turkish-backed rebels warring the other factions on the ground. Idlib province had escaped much of the recent violence, providing sanctuary to many refugees fleeing the main conflict zone. But clashes recently erupted between Hay'et Tahrir al-Sham and the Turkish-backed Ahrar al-Sham. Hay'et Tahrir al-Sham is the latest incarnation of al-Nusra Front, formerly aligned to al-Qaeda. That's put Turkey in another tight spot and adds to its security concerns, and calls into question how the US and Russia may respond, further complicating an already volatile power dynamic on the ground. Shoaib Hassan, the Newsmakers.
Well, let's go to our panel. I'm joined from Paris by Can Kasapoğlu. He's a defense analyst at EDAM, a Center for Economics and Foreign Policy Studies. From Washington, D.C., Mark Kimmett, a retired U.S. Army Brigadier General and former spokesman for the U.S. military in Iraq. And from Moscow, Dmitry Babich. He's a political commentator at Sputnik International. Gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us. Can, if I may begin with you first, is what we're seeing in northern Syria, maybe it's not by design, but is the north splitting up as we speak?
Well, first of all, there is a huge geopolitical reason for the ongoing security crisis, especially following the Syrian Ba'athist regime extending its full control over Aleppo. We see that many opposition armed groups from different kinds of ideologies, different kinds of alliances, and under different kinds of umbrella organizations are now stuck in the narrow confine of Idlib. So what we are talking about is a very limited territory and population to be controlled. That's the first thing. And secondly, as the sponsors of different opposition groups like Qatar, like Saudi Arabia, are now limiting their assistance and help to the Syrian opposition, there is an ongoing trend of fight for limited resources. And lastly, there will be the new rounds of Astana talks, and the Geneva process is also ongoing. So I think no group in the opposition, in a wide array of opposition spectrum, so to speak, doesn't want to be left out in the cold when the music stops. I think that was inevitable. That was there, waiting for us. And this crisis actually is tactically seem to be won by the continuation of al-Nusra. HTS, which means that Turkey is now bordering, after bordering Daesh, is now bordering al-Qaeda in its borders.
Right.
I think that's the biggest security concern now.
Okay, Dmitry Babic, has it become a self-fulfilling prophecy for the Russians in many ways? Because the argument for quite a number of years has been, well, it's either Assad or it's the extremists. And when we see a group linked to al-Qaeda taking over Idlib and knocking out al-Sham, for all intents and purposes, maybe moderate as compared especially to HTS, does that become a self-fulfilling prophecy where everybody came on board and now the Russians get to finally say with a lot of credibility, if you look at who has control of the different lands, it's Assad or it says it's the extremists?
Well, I think it's not self-fulfilling. It's just a prophecy that unfortunately came true. I think it was clear from the very beginning that Mr. Assad's regime was far from perfect. It was not reported by the Western media, but the Russian foreign minister criticized Assad for lack of democratic reform. The Russian media criticized him a lot. But that regime was at least secular, and Mr. Assad was oriented to Europe. Unfortunately, he did not orient himself to Russia until you know, the hammer came to the anvil. But that regime was at least secular. Now the groups that we see fighting for control in northwestern Syria, I mean, this is really a very dangerous situation. Yep. And this is something that I think should be prevented, the partition of Syria and the partition especially of the northern part of Syria. That's why Russia has been pushing for negotiations in Astana. We are co-sponsors together with Turkey of the negotiations in Astana. Let me remind you that in 2012 it was Russia who insisted on the first round of negotiations in Geneva. The Western countries, the United States, the European Union, they were very reluctant to start them because they expected Mr. Assad to fall and then all the problems would be resolved in their view. So it's just a natural consequence of a very badly thought out foreign intervention into Syrian affairs. It's very nice, it's very good that Turkey is now taking a much different stance from what it had a few years ago.
Okay. So let me ask Mark Kimmitt. General Kimmitt, was this a mistake in retrospect, given that it seems as if Assad, the Russians and the Iranians have all but won as things stand?
Well, I don't necessarily think this is an issue of winning or losing by outside powers. The real question is, what do the people of Syria want? It was clear that the Assad regime was committing near genocide on some of their groups. He is no longer a legitimate leader. There wasn't a democratic method by which to replace him. That was the policy of the Obama administration. I think the policy of the Trump administration is a bit more nuanced. First and foremost, our focus inside of Syria right now is the destruction of ISIS, winning the war against ISIS inside Raqqa. The issue of the opposition groups, that changed considerably when the Russians conducted the actual foreign intervention in 2015 to prop up the Assad regime. And the Russians are playing a very interesting game here. I don't think it's an issue simply of Idlib or any tactical battle, but it's clearly the desire of the Russians to make Syria a client state of theirs, far more so than it had been in the past. Right. And also, Russia doesn't want to lose Syria to the Iranians. Right. So I think at the end of the day, the United States and its coalition partners will remain focused on ISIS. As to the future partition or unitary nature of Syria, I think that's going to be decided through political discussions and negotiations more than anything else.
Okay, I want you to have a listen to the Turkish Deputy Prime Minister Numan Kurtulmuş. Have a listen to what he had to say about the United States supporting groups that are enemies of Turkey. Have a listen.
Buradaki terör örgütlerine siz silah verdikten sonra o silah.
How will you take back these weapons from terrorist organizations once you supply these arms to them? We know that these are very heavy and potent weapons. Even though the United States is our ally, they have formed more than a terrorist organization there. They have formed a small-scale army. And one of the main goals of this army is to move against Turkey. This is unacceptable. It doesn't fit friendship.
Okay, General Kimmett, so the policy is to fight Daesh. In order to fight Daesh, the United States supporting the SDF, which includes the YPG, which turns its guns and bombs on Turkey as well. Do you genuinely believe that the United States actually believes that reassurance that they gave to Turkey, and they believe that they're going to get those weapons back after these guys defeat Daesh in Raqqa?
Well, as the Deputy Foreign Minister said, there have been some large weapon systems that have been provided to the SDF. There is no proof, no evidence that those weapons have been used by anyone against Turkish forces. We use a system inside the United States run by both the State Department and the DoD called end-use monitoring. Yes, we do expect to get those heavy weapons back. Yes, there is a process by which we monitor the transportation and the management of those weapon systems. And I agree with the Deputy Foreign Minister that there are legitimate security concerns that Turkey can have with regards to their borders and regarding the infiltration of these weapons and these fighters into Turkey. That is not the United States policy, and we certainly don't want to see Turkey's sovereignty or territory at risk by forces fighting ISIS inside of Syria, one day turning their guns on the Turkish people.
Okay, Dimitri, I know you want to come in, but just give me a moment. I want to get John's perspective on this for a second. John, do you believe that? Do you think it's going to be that easy, that the weapons are just going to go back to the United States and the YPG is going to say, hey, we're not interested in a state here in northern Syria, we're not going to keep these weapons?
Well, personally speaking, I really value the Turkish-American strategic partnership and defense ties, and I think these ties really help both nations to develop their security and national defense capacities. That being said, I have some tangible doubts about this arms transfers to PYD. The first thing is we don't see a buyback calendar here, a buyback roadmap here. So the thing is we know that certain weapons are being transferred to PYD, but when or where will United States get back these kind of capabilities? And by the way, these are game changer capabilities. We are talking about anti-tank guided missiles. We are talking about recoilless rifles. We are talking about really tactical game changer systems, which we saw the results, the kind of results on the ground back in 2006 in Lebanon, when Israeli defense forces faced with these kind of formidable hybrid capabilities at the hands of Lebanese Hezbollah. Secondly, we don't see any open, tangible limitations about those arms. So those arms will be used in Raqqa. We know that. We know that the Trump administration is putting the ISIS threat in the forefront. We also know that. But we don't know after Raqqa, eventually the city gonna fall. We don't know after Raqqa whether PYD will just keep holding those weapons and they're gonna use it elsewhere or not. Right. We don't have any clear roadmap about that.
There's a theory
lastly, we see a lot of.
Go ahead.
We see that a terrorist personnel can just start his career at the ranks of PKK and then end up fighting for PYD in Raqqa.
Got it.
So of course Turkey, I think relies on its American ally, but to what extent America can rely on PYD instead of
and Turkey has been going blue in the face saying, hey, you guys don't see the direct link and we do, and we're giving you the evidence. Dimitri, come in.
Well, I think we all remember some very negative experience that the whole world had with American weapons supplied to Afghan Mujahideen. I don't know about the end use or some other strategies that the United States has. They said the same thing about the Afghan Mujahideen. We know that terrible weapons that had been given to them by the Americans in order to fight the Soviet army they later popped up in the hands of terrorists around the world. Sometimes they were used against Americans.
Okay.
So we have some very bad experience here, and there is no reason not to expect that the same story will repeat itself between YPG and
we'll
PKK. And the other important moment, when when the general said that Russia intervened in Syria in 2015, let me remind you that Russia came there on an invitation from the Syrian government. Before the Russian planes started operating, the United States and their coalition had been bombing Syria for 11 months, and despite that, the so-called Islamic State kept expanding.
Certainly, Dimitri.
The Islamic State started to shrink only after Russia got involved.
Dimitri, by
That's
2015,
important.
there had been, in some circles, unanimity that in many ways the government had lost its legitimacy because at that time, 250,000 people, the vast majority of them, were killed by Bashar al-Assad's forces, by barrel bombs, and so on. This is why
Let me respond to that.
Let
me respond to that.
Okay, go for it.
Let me respond to that. By that time, no, you don't give me a chance to respond. Now listen to me.
I'm saying go ahead.
By that time, the whole world has seen by that time, the whole world has seen how the so-called freedom fighters, backed by the United States in Syria, have been executing Syrian soldiers in public, on television, how one of them had eaten the heart of a Syrian soldier. So the world has seen a lot of atrocities committed by the people supported by the United States and the European Union. Okay. By the time Russia had come to Syria, the American bombers have been bombing Syria for 11 months, and they were not invited by anyone. Russia was invited by the Syrian government, which is a member of the United Nations.
Okay. See, gave you an opportunity. Mark Kimmitt, after Raqqa, and we hope, as you mentioned earlier on, we hope for the people of Raqqa that they are liberated from the diabolical forces of Daesh. If Raqqa is won, what happens? There's a theory that Deir ez-Zor, there'll be a race for Deir ez-Zor, and we'll see the regime trying to fill the gaps while others are going to go for Deir ez-Zor. What's going to happen after Raqqa, Mark Kimmitt?
Yeah, well, first of all, I've got to think my way through that answer because I'm still focused on the last answers that we've heard from our guests because they were so rife with inaccuracies, I couldn't help but laugh. Look, it is clear that the reason that the United States and its 70 coalition partners are inside of Syria right now supporting the SDF and others is to defeat ISIS. If in fact there are remaining ISIS elements once the defeat of ISIS is complete inside of Raqqa, we will continue to pursue them. That is our objective. We don't have any long-term territorial ambitions. We don't look at Syria as an opportunity to expand our footprint in the Middle East. The 70 nations of the coalition have a clear mission, and they're focused on that mission alone. The three-nation coalition of Russia, Iran, and Syria may have other plans for Syria in the long run, but at this point, that's not the mission of the United States. There may be some people thinking about that, but right now, our focus is ISIS.
Okay, John, is it now a question of when rather than if Turkey will move on Afrin?
Well, first of all, we should understand Turkey's threat perceptions emanating from Syria. Turkey has been surrounded by three very dangerous terrorist actors like al-Qaeda, ISIS, and PKK's affiliates. That's something that any nation state cannot even dream of. And I think, like, coming to your question, I'm going to be very direct. I think you are right. It is a matter of like when rather than if, because like operating in Afrin means like cutting the rising al-Qaeda elements, possible routes to expand their terrorist campaign into the Turkish territory first, and especially it means denying PYD's de facto corridor and that kind of de facto autonomy being imposed on Turkey, or the emergence, let's say, of a PKK-affiliated Syrian Kurdish autonomous region. Ankara made it very clear that it won't let something like that happen because like it would have very open, like inevitable terrorist infiltrations and grave national security threats directed to Turkey.
Unfortunately, I've got to move on. We've run out of time, but thank you to you, Dimitri Babic, General Kimmitt, and Can Kasapoğlu. Thanks so much.